Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrayer, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrayer. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrayer.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Nara. It's my pleasure to welcome Maxim Shrayer from Boston College for a discussion of poetry, language, and memory in the time of wars. Dr. Shrayer chairs the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies. He's director of East European and Eurasian Studies program and professor of Russian, English, and Jewish Studies in Boston College. He is literary scholar, bilingual Russian-American author, translator, author of over 30 books. Welcome, Maxim. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I've been a listener and admirer of your program. I really think it's unique and you're doing fabulous work, much more important than my little contribution to Ukraine's war against Russia's aggression. But for whatever it's worth, I'll talk about what I've been doing. And the title sounds really grand, which is Poetry, Language, and Memory at the Time of Wars. I'll explain right away that wars refers to two wars that have one way or another been at the center of my life and my work as an author, as an academic, I guess as a public intellectual. Of course, the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia's neo-colonial aggression, and the war and conflict in Israel. Ukraine and Israel are places that I have very close ancestral and familial connections, and so I have been writing a lot about both places. I unfortunately have not been to Ukraine since before the start of the war. I do go to Israel frequently, and one of my purposes is, through some of the poetry that I will share, is to make the obvious point, which unfortunately is not made frequently enough or strongly enough, which is that Russia's war against Ukraine and the war of Israel's enemies against Israel and the survival of the Jewish state are deeply intertwined. And it's very important to understand that I'm no political scientist, but from everything I know, the recent conflict with Iran has thrown into yet the sharpest relief the fact that Ukraine and Israel share common enemies that desire upon Ukraine and Israel the end of their sovereignty and statehood. Now, to backtrack a little bit and to explain my connection to Ukraine. In terms of my ancestry, I'm 3/4 Jewish Ukrainian. This, in some ways, is not particularly unique. The majority of ex-Soviet Jews, so I've been an emigre, an expatriate for nearly 40 years, and the majority of Jews from the former Soviet Union, of course, are have their roots in what is now modern Ukraine and parts of Eastern Poland. After that, Belarus and parts of Eastern Poland, Lithuania, Bessarabia. But in my case, two of my late grandfathers, whom I knew well, both were born in Kamenets-Podilsky, which used to be a provincial capital. It's actually the site of the farthest penetration of Ottoman Turkey into Ukrainian lands, Eastern European lands in that area. It still has this old Turkish fortress on the Smotrich River. So both of them had roots there and grew up there and actually knew each other in Kamenets-Podilsky. Now Kamenets-Podilsky is no longer a provincial capital, it's part of the Khmelnytsky province, but basically this is where family, both the Shrayer family and the family of my maternal grandfather, the last name there is Polak, that's where they had been living, that's where their graves were, that's where many of them were killed during the Shoah. And also on the side of my maternal grandmother, she comes from Bar, which is in the Vinnytsia province. And before World War II and the Shoah, and also before the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s, we had an large, extensive family in Ukraine. Part of the family had left in the 1920s to go to Palestine, but others migrated to large Soviet cities, Moscow and Leningrad most characteristically, but others still remained. So if you were to travel to Kamenets today, you could still find our ancestral graves at the old Jewish cemetery, and also the Shrayer house is actually an office of a local court. It still stands. So 3/4, and then 1/4 is Litvak, Lithuanian. And so I feel very strongly that this war is my war in many ways. It's a war against the land where my roots are. It's a war against the land where so many Jewish memories in my family are. And while it's important not to overplay the point I'm about to make, but I think we should also acknowledge that Russia's aggression is continuing to destroy what remains of Jewish memory in Ukraine, in an odd way, continuing what had been going on there during the Soviet decades and then during the Shoah and the post-Shoah Soviet decades. So that's the brief story of my connection. And I've been to Ukraine most recently. I used to go to Crimea when it was still part of Ukraine to do research on the Holocaust on the Shoah in Crimea. I stopped going after Russia's annexation. But I have, personally been there. I've even taken my older daughter, Mira, who's 20, on a visit with me once to Kiev and then to Crimea. What I'd like to do is to share with you, so since the start of the war, since Russia's invasion, I've been writing about the war and about my Ukrainian connections in both poetry, in both English and Russian, and in nonfiction and polemical essays. However, just as a matter of record, the first time I ever wrote about Ukraine was in my literary memoir, Waiting for America, which came out in 2006. And it's set in Italy in the summer of 1987, and it features the experience of ex-Soviet immigrants, the majority of whom are Jewish or have Jewish family members who are waiting to come to America or Canada as refugees. And there's a chapter there that specifically examines various complexities of the Jewish-Ukrainian mixed marriage, where one of the characters is Jewish and the other of Ukrainian ancestry. And it gets into some questions that I think merit exploration, not just through the lens of history, but also through the lens of narrative memoirs. However, specifically with your permission, I'll share some work from 3 recent books. This collection, which is called Kinship, and I will speak about the importance of the word kinship. It is about roots, it's about a familial, and about the memory connection to Ukraine. And then this book, Zion Square, which you can see in the backdrop, where I have continued to write about the war in Ukraine and more in the way it's intertwined with the war and conflict in Israel. And the third book, this book, which came out in Switzerland just this past year, which is called Parallel Letters. It's a bilingual book of English language and Russian language poems. It features a number of poems with Ukrainian themes. What is my take on what I'm trying to get across? Of course, going beyond the obvious despair with which I have been living since the invasion of Ukraine, despair and shame, I write about roots. I write about the Soviet past. I had lived in Moscow in the Soviet Union for the first 20 years of my life, and how that baggage, I think, is not so easy to dispose of. And when in today's conditions, when Russia and Ukraine pitted against one another, and where Russia is the aggressor, of course, bearers of Russian culture are pressed upon to figure out their relationship with the Soviet past. I also, like I said, am exploring the mixed marriages of Jews and Ukrainians and the Ukrainian-Israel parallels. I would like to open with a poem from my collection Kinship, the poem that gave the collection its title. It's a longish poem, but why I want to start with it is it explains my roots, and it also explains that sense of despair and rage that I feel. Kinship. Ukraine, my birthland. Grandfather Aron, Arkady, used to say. He grew up in Kamenets-Podilsky and only in the 1920s moved to Moscow, became a paver, then a telephone engineer. My other grandfather, Pesach, Pyotr, was also born in Kamenets. Prior to entering the gymnasium, he spoke Ukrainian not as well as Yiddish, but still much better than Russian. After a lifetime of living in Leningrad, Grandfather Pyotr never forgot Ukraine, the high bank of the Smotrich, the Turkish bridge, the mills on the land our family used to rent from a Polish count. Nyusia Moshkovna Studnitz, my maternal grandmother, was born in the town of Bar, now in Vinnytsia province. She studied at the Kharkov Institute of Engineering and Economics. In the late 1930s, she married and settled in Moscow to become a consummate resident of the capital. She spoke Russian with barely a trace of the Ukrainian accent, her speech giving away the old Moscow sing-song intonation. And yet, to her, a Jewish woman, a Muscovite, Ukraine remained the realm of youth and orphanhood, the house of first love. My mother was born in Moscow, my father in Leningrad. As young people, they visited with the relatives who had survived and returned to Ukraine after the Shoah in Kamenets, Kiev, Vinnytsia, and Odessa. During the 20 years I spent in the former empire, only once did I visit Ukraine, summer of 1986, a brief stay in Luhansk province. Years later, already an American, a Jewish immigrant, I came to Kiev, first alone, then with my older daughter, Mira. She was 7. 6 months later, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Visiting Ukraine during the post-Soviet years, I was in the grip of mixed emotions. Yes, this was the birthplace of my grandparents, the land in which our family tree was deeply rooted. In this sense, my experience was typical of Soviet Jews. Could I think of Ukraine only as a place on a map of the past, where generations of my ancestors had been born and raised, went to shul, worked the land? How could I not think of Ukraine as a place on the map of Europe where in ditches and ravines at the bottom of ponds lay our bones, the bones of murdered Jews? Why speak of it now? And to pause for a second, if I were to write the poem today and not the day after the war started, I would have emphasized this very point. Why speak of it now? Because it may come across as idle. But look, hindsight is more than 20/20. This is how I felt, and I still feel to some degree this way. Why speak about it now? Because on February 24th, all those jumbled, contradictory feelings receded into the background. Ukraine became my own native land, when the enemies of peace invaded. Now Ukraine is a target of Russia's imperial aggression, a victim with which I feel both kinship and solidarity. Every day I undergo emotional torment because the troops of Russia, the land of my first language, are massacring Ukraine to my terror and shame. As I think of the war in Ukraine, I cannot but turn in my thoughts to those men and women who wear Russian military uniforms, and especially to the culpable, the generals and admirals, the commanding officers of the Russian army, air force, and navy. If only one of them refused to carry out their orders, if only one hesitated to turn soldiers into statistics, if only one of them cared not to disfigure what little remains of Russia's culture and its hopes for the future. Cursed be you, the Bedlamite who dispatched the Russian troops to annihilate Ukraine, to die on my ancestors' native land. So that's the first poem I wanted to share. I just want to make sure that you can hear me. And Victor, if you have any questions, and the other co-hosts, please jump in. So everything is working, I assume?
Everything works. We hear you
Perfect.
well. We're absolutely admiring. And if somebody has any comment, we're informal, please.
Thank you. And I just want to belabor the point I made in the final stanza, where I talk about the culpability of Russia's military commanders. This is a point that I have been making in my other research, which has to do with the Shoah, with the mass murder of Jews by Germans and Austrians and their local accomplices, but also, and that's important, in connection with certain pages of Soviet history. I must say that it troubles me a great deal when public intellectuals in the West make the point that everything is somehow up to Putin. This most recently came up, and this probably will be the most polemical point of what I will say, at the Cannes Festival, where the Grand Prix went to a talented director of Russian, I believe Siberian origin, by the name of Andrei Zvyagintsev, where he made a controversial, these are very short acceptance speeches, but the point of his speech was to speak to Putin, to the president. And what he said is that it's up to you to stop the war. And this does not sit too well with me. I think the bigger point is that it is up to every military commander, every senior field officer, every general and admiral. And of course, it is important to know that a refusal to carry out orders, when these orders directly contradict basic tenets of human ethics and basic tenets of military strategy, has occurred in totalitarian regimes. And the most famous example of that. And by the way, this poem has a Russian language parallel version, which is different because, of course, if I were to speak about it in the English language poem, this would have been largely lost. But in the Russian language poem, I go back to the famous workers' uprising in Novocherkassk in 1962. This was an industrial city in the former area of the host of the Don Cossacks. And because of price hikes, and this is, by the way, the peak of the so-called second Khrushchev thaw, when Khrushchev was actively engaging with the intelligentsia to defeat the Stalinists that had still remained in the Soviet leadership. But basically, the workers rose in protests, and of course, troops were sent to suppress this uprising. And the initial person who was put in charge of this was a decorated hero of World War II, a lieutenant general by the name of Shaposhnikov, who refused to give orders to shoot at the workers, who were, of course, unarmed. And when asked why, he said, I am not disobeying the oath I had given, but I'm refusing to give this order because there's no strategic point to it. But of course, it's not so much what he said, it's what he did. He refused to shoot at innocent workers who, of course, were ethnically diverse. They were Cossacks, they were Ukrainians, they were Jews, they were Tatars. The point of it is they were unarmed. And of course, he destroyed his life, as you can imagine what happened to him. But to me, this is a symbolic example of a general who refuses to carry out orders. And I have yet to find an example of a military commander from the Russian side who has refused to carry out order. I think that person would have earned himself or herself a place in history. So I say this that because the poem I read was written the day after the Russian invasion, but I believe the bigger point still stands, that I think people over-obsess with Putin's executive command at the expense of the larger point of the culpability of tens of thousands of people who lead the troops into aggression and force the soldiers, the regular military men and women, to commit war crimes in the name of what? So this is something that I certainly agonize over. If there are any comments or questions, I'm happy to take them now.
We have a hand up. Dr. Deutsch, please.
Given the affinity between Ukraine and Israel, how do you explain the unwillingness of Israel to provide military support to Ukraine before Hamas invaded Israel?
I am actually planning to speak about it. And I also will speak about it as a writer, not as a military strategist. I have no professional opinion, because to answer this question, I don't know if you are that person, sir, but one needs to be extremely well versed in what is happening on the surface and also what is happening clandestinely. But I think you also should know, and I will address that point, that Israel has sent volunteers to Ukraine, has given a lot of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and that Israelis have died on Ukrainian soil for Ukraine's sovereignty. I think this point speaks loud to what is really happening, as opposed to what is happening on the broad surface of diplomacy and military strategy. In an odd way, it's an unanswerable question, just as the question of why Israel had not, quote unquote, recognized Armenian genocide until a couple of weeks ago used to be unanswerable. I mean, of course, we understand why, because Israel could not antagonize Turkey, but it obviously has reached a point when it's prepared to do that. So I think, again, I'm no authority on this, but I think where it's going now is that the Russia-Israel relations are already entangled with Russia's strong continued help to the enemies of Israel. But I suspect it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So that's the brief of it. I will read a poem that speaks of this specifically. Well, you know what? I might as well do it now, and if you don't like it, so be it. But the question of Israel's relations with Ukraine is super important because Israel has over 1 million ex-Soviets, and then, of course, extended families, and not all of them, and a minority of them came from major Russian cities. A larger part of them came from Ukraine, from Belarus, from former Bessarabia, from Moldova, and, of course, some of the volunteers, Israeli volunteers who fought in Ukraine are boys who came to Israel as children, or some of them born in Israel to ex-Soviet parents from Ukraine. To my dismay, this is not fully acknowledged the way it should be, because Israel is a very small country, and for it to send volunteers to fight in Ukraine for Ukraine is a true act, not just of symbolism, but of a commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. And it concerns me also because there is a not necessarily numerically representative, but intellectually representative and culturally representative body of individuals in Ukraine and in places of diaspora, particularly in the US and Canada, who have been making, to me, a rather absurd point, if you know anything about Soviet history or the history of the Near East, that the point that what Ukraine is to Russia, Gaza and the West Bank is to Israel. This point keeps coming up, and I think it needs to be dealt with by political scientists, which I am not. But I did write a poem that touches on this, which is called Israeli Soldiers in Ukraine, in which I try to give voice both to the facts that Israelis have died in Ukraine for Ukraine, but also with my discomfort with this argument. Israeli soldiers in Ukraine. Israeli soldiers volunteering in Ukraine. Your Ukrainian accents audible in Russian, but not in Hebrew. Your faces Levantine, your stars of David like insignia of pain. Israeli soldiers fighting in Ukraine, in Solidar and Bakhmut, Mariupol and Kherson, in fields of ripening wheat, in valleys of stone, in seething trenches and open terrain. Israeli soldiers dying for Ukraine, where your ancestors lie in ditches and ravines. Could you imagine a Ukrainian bard or poet crying for Gaza, but not for Israel? And to be quite honest, I have trouble imagining that for whatever it's worth, but one has to represent oneself truthfully and not just because one is speaking in a forum that is advocating for Ukraine, as I do every day of my life and teaching. Now, to return to some of the things that I wanted to share, one of the, and this is almost unavoidable when your professional field has to do with 20th century culture and with Jewish culture. It's Odessa, which of course has been on my mind. I actually wrote earlier in my career a whole book about Odessan writers, mainly Bible and Bagritsky, but also of various questions of cultural and literary origins. And when Odessa was bombed, I kept asking myself, well, other than donating money, offering spiritual support, teaching, which I have been, or writing polemical essays, what else can one do? And I sort of concluded that one can also give voice to dreams, to one's imagination, which is what writers do. And so I wrote a poem about the bombing of Odessa, in which I imagine a kind of magical defense, a kind of literary iron dome, if you will, which will protect the skies of Odessa against Russian planes and drones. And I imagined it is a kind of magical chorus of poets who at one point or another lived in Odessa. And of course, these poets came from different backgrounds and religions and wrote in many different languages, but they were first and foremost Odessans and had a lot of closeness to Ukrainian culture, not just Jewish culture or Russian culture or French culture. The bombing of Odessa. And by the way, formerly, I'm trying to also give you a sense of different prosodic forms that I practice. So the poem that I opened with, it was written in long stanzas, each of which is 9 lines, kind of an experimental stanza. This poem formally is a little more traditional. It's in couplets, which is a form, of course, well known and practiced in English language poetry. Oh, Russia, my birthland, I pity your destiny. Russian troops are bombing Odessa. Putin's generals, death and deputy, craving Odessa, a fallen Odessa. As desperate missiles descend on Odessa, poets and sages come to its rescue. They summon the shadows of fellow singers who once lived and loved in this city of cities. They wrote in Yiddish, Ukrainian, Russian, Hebrew and Polish, Tatar and Italian. From verses of the past, they're rising like zealots not to allow the murder of Odessa. Bialik is counting the wounded and the dead. Now the city of slaughter is here in Odessa. Akhmatova, lithe like a Black Sea deity, unsheathes her father's Damascus naval dagger. Shimon Frug, the Jewish Aeolian harpist, thrusts a stick hand grenade under his belt. Sasha Chorny, the scion of Odessan pharmacists, is preparing bottles of anti-tank cocktails. Jabot, fiercely smiling like a conjurer at play, commands a unit of harbor patrol. Lesia Ukrainka, Kajibey's salty air, takes an old shot at the attic. Bunin trades in his ornate walking stick for a Mauser rifle with a sword bayonet. Volodymyr Sasura mounts a Maxim gun on the dome of the opera house at dawn. Febrile Bagritsky from Deribasovska's roofs sends postal doves to Ukrainian troops. Their voices and weapons form a sound defense to deter Russia's weapons of death. Undefeatable and ambidextrous, we shall always fight for you, my Odessa. And perhaps I should just briefly explicate. So these voices, well, there's a certain deliberateness in the names and the poets I chose. I wanted them to be as different as poets can be, but as you can see, it includes classics of modern Ukrainian poetry like Lesia and Sasura, but also it includes Bialik, one of the founding fathers of modern Hebrew poetry. And the thinking here is he went once to Kishinev to bear witness to the Kishinev pogrom, and he wrote a short poem of rage, and he wrote a longer poem called In the City of Slaughter, Be'ir HaChariga in Hebrew. So I'm thinking that if he were alive today, he would be writing about Odessa in the City of Slaughter. Or Ivan Bunin, who was the first Russian language writer to receive the Nobel Prize in 1933. He was an emigre, a staunch anti-Bolshevik, and never a Russian nationalist. Bunin incidentally grew up in the south of Russia and interacted with a lot of ethnic Ukrainians, understood Ukrainian well, and quotes Ukrainian speech in his fiction a number of times. So he lived in Odessa before emigrating, having already left Russia. And I think I know what side he would be on. In fact, I think I know what side all of these writers would be on. And so that's kind of flight of fancy. But I do think that a chorus of writers coming to Odessa's defense is a powerful weapon in its own right. So let me pause again and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Maxim. Thank you. Thank you also for this passionate explication, because I'm probably the only one here who can relate to most of the names, not all. But
they all lived in Odessa. That's actually
yes,
the
sure,
important
for
part.
sure, and not many in Russia would know that Akhmatova comes from the same place.
She was born in
Yes,
Odessa,
yes.
and in fact, why I say that she would find her late father's naval dagger is because he was a naval officer. So basically, what is important to project is back then and now. In other words, her father, if he were in Odessa today, would have been an Ukrainian naval officer. You see, the point is not one's ethnic origin. The point is one's commitment to truth and justice. That's what I imagine here.
And also, we more than once talked on this program on how relevant these events of 100 years ago are, because all these ghosts of war just returning from dormancy, they haven't gone away under Soviet freeze. And that's why we can relate to them much, I would say, deeper than an American, for example, would relate to Revolutionary or even Civil War.
100%. I completely agree.
This is the legacy of this archaic society that you and me grew up in, and which we keep returning to on this program, because all these issues are not just complexity of identity, but generational complexities of identity.
Absolutely, which is why, and again, I don't like to attack single individuals, but I thought so much more could have been said with an audience of 40 millions watching the awards at the Cannes Festival. So when an expatriate Russian director says, first of all, addresses Putin, and then follows up in an interview and explicates that his new film, which I'm so much looking forward to seeing, The Minotaur, is, and this is a direct quote, for the Russian mind. I have no idea what he's talking about. What Russian mind? This is a fatal flaw of this thinking. I don't write for the Russian mind, and I have no desire or capability of writing for the Russian mind. My own cultural equipment aside, I write these poems for Ukraine, for Israel, and out of, I hope, a clarity of mind of where truth and justice belong in this conflict. So let's maybe turn to a slightly lighter note, because I have been writing political satire. I find satire in general a very useful tool to imagine conflict and various thorny situations. So I've written a couple of poems. This is in my collection, Zion Square, this collection, which deal with ex-Russian, ex-Soviet expatriates living in Europe, some of whom fled after Russia invaded Ukraine, but really have very mixed feelings about themselves, about their future, and about the conflict. And this leads, in my view, to some fairly comical situations, which I've tried to document. So I'm going to read two poems, one of which is set in Berlin, which of course has a huge colony of more recent expatriates, and the other one in Vienna, which has a large community of Ukrainian refugees who have now become, residents of Vienna. And you hear Ukrainian speech in Vienna a lot, and this is something I know from annual experience visiting there. So the first poem, and so this is, like I said, in the vein of satire, although nothing is pure satire, it's lyrical satire. This is called Verses About a Burned Passport. Here you go. A Berlin-based artist born in Bukhara to a family of former evacuees and raised in Brooklyn, in the midst of Soviet emigres, burned his Russian passport in front of a small crowd on Unter den Linden. At the opening of an anti-war installation, an inquisitive German journalist posed a question to the artist. I thought you were Ukrainian. Where did the Russian passport come from, and why burn it? The author of the burned passport replied to the German, I am an American expat Jew of Ukrainian descent. My Russian passport is nothing but an error of history. My ancestors hail from outside Kharkiv, and only one grandmother is Russian, but actually a Chuvash, a Cheremisian, an old Soviet chameleon. Enough already with your silly questions. It was an act of protest against atrocities, an act of self-purification. I read this account on social media and thought to myself, they took away my Soviet passport at the time of emigration in exchange for an exit visa to Israel, which was subsequently stolen in Pompeii at the temple of Fortuna Augusta, and later replaced with Italian refugee papers I showed them when entering America. I have nothing to immolate except my memory, but memory doesn't burn at the Brandenburg Gate in the shadow of flowering lime trees on Unter den Linden on the banks of the Shrayer. Like a broken prayer, memory wouldn't leave the Jew alone. And I must say, this is one of the reasons I write about Ukraine, is because as a Jew, Ukraine is alive in my memory. It is one of the strongest territories of my memory. And the second poem, which is set in Vienna, let me just find the page, because I thought I had it earmarked. Here we go. This one is called A Guide to Russian Vienna, and you will understand what's going on here, and if not, I will offer a little bit of a afterword. Now, put the cash away, conniver. This gets you nowhere in Wien. Jump in the Uber, tell the driver you want to go back to Lviv. The driver from Chechnya or Georgia will recognize your cheap burlesque. A refugee, like hell you are, colonial hunger in your eyes. Ukrainian fricatives have trouble exploding in your Nevan throat. They called your bluff. They pierced your bubble. You're nobody but yourself. Freud's favorite analyst, a leading supporter of secession, a firebird born of Soviet legends, empire's useful idiot. Forget your past. It's worth deleting. The savage war, the awkward rhyme. Transform yourself and start believing in your inexpiable crime. Though perhaps if it's not obvious already, and this is a situation I have observed, this is actually a recent Russian expatriate who is passing herself off for a Ukrainian refugee in Vienna, so as to get sympathy and better treatment. What an absurd scenario of history. And whatever is going on in the minds of such imposters, I wanted to sort of give it a quick fix so that he would live on in memory. I can stop here if you'd like and take questions, or I could read one more short poem. What is your preference?
Short poem, please.
Short poem.
I love how you read. I love the energy. I'm still, from the very first thing you read, I'm still remembering the names of your grandparents, and I feel like I can imagine what they look like. Short poem, please.
I should tell you, by the way, that they all remembered Ukrainian. And in fact, my maternal grandmother, who I probably got to know the longest, and she came to America with us, and she lived till 95. It was a part of herself that she did not conceal, but certainly did not over-advertise in her Moscow life. but it was there. And then also I got to know, after we had already emigrated, my father's older uncle. So there were 5 children who lived to adulthood in the Shrayer family from communists. And one of them in 1924 escaped via Odessa to mandatory Palestine because there was an order out for his arrest because he was a socialist Zionist. He was the most Ukrainian of the siblings. And when I saw him several times, this came up in conversations, and he went on and on how his best childhood friend was a boy called Mikolka, and how basically he still remembers their conversations in Ukrainian. We're talking about 70 years hence, imagine. So this is not just imagination like in the Odessa poem. It is also something I know from experience. But thank you so much, Katerina. Yeah. So the poem that I will read last is a poem that is not about Ukraine or Israel or even Russia, but it is a poem about survival of memory under political duress and about immigration, as you know better than I do, as the organizers of this wonderful forum. The war in Ukraine also created a new large Ukrainian diaspora the world over, but especially in Europe, and I suspect, of course, in Israel and in North America. And so the story of how emigres continue to live in touch with ancestral lands and how they imagine their return is a story that is in many ways part of my experience and my interest, because a lot of my work deals with expatriate and multilingual writers. This specific poem is actually about Thomas Mann. You might say, why Thomas Mann? Well, the obvious reason is that, of course, Thomas Mann opposed Nazism. He left Nazi Germany and he settled in the United States. Some of you may know this. He settled in Ukraine. Yes, that's a nice Freudian slip. He settled in California on the West Coast, in Pacific Palisades, where you can still see his house, although it's not a museum. The Leon Furtwänger's house is a museum. But Thomas Mann was kind of the center of a community of expatriates from German, Austrian, and Bohemian lands who settled around Hollywood. They were writers, composers, film directors, intellectuals. And so he stayed there throughout the war. And of course, after the war, he started thinking of a return. And he was really under a lot of pressure from the CIA and the United States government structures not to visit what would become East Germany for obvious ideological reasons. And he was uncomfortable with such a deliberate refusal. And this all, I mean, really, when push came to shove is when Goethe's bicentennial was celebrated in 1949, and Thomas Mann returned, but he insisted not just on visiting the lands that were now in West Germany, but also he wanted to visit Weimar, of course, Goethe's birthplace, and Lübeck, his native city in the north of Germany. And so this was a matter of some tension and conflict. And in the end, of course, Thomas Mann visited, but he settled in Switzerland, like Nabokov would in the late 50s, early 60s. So the poem is called Last Will and Testament. And after that, I'm happy to entertain a few more questions. Thomas Mann has returned to the city of Lübeck. The municipal elders have gathered to welcome him home. He's old. He blushes. He feels like a young German lover, and he doesn't know how to abolish his shame. Katya Mann tells her husband, "We don't belong in this country. How eerie this place, how sated with murderous joy. All is lost. At the Kirche, the bride has been wailing since sunrise. Yehuda's great organ has been vandalized and destroyed. Darling," says Thomas Mann, "on the strand of my youth, Travemünde, sand is weightless like ashes and cold like unearthly embrace. All my life, I've been faithful to Germany. Now, what an ending to discover that nothing of mine remains." And one brief commentary is, I'm in no way drawing parallels, God forbid, with Thomas Mann. That's the most ludicrous possibility. No, what I'm thinking about is the destinies of thousands, tens of thousands of those who grew up surrounded by Russian culture, who considered themselves culturally Russian, who are now living outside of Russia, and who, of course, fervently hope for Ukraine's victory and for the end of the rule of this murderous gang of Putin and associates. I cannot speak for the collective psyche of all those expatriates, but I think many of them, many of us imagine the possibility of return once the regime falls. I stopped going to Russia after the invasion. I broke off all ties, academic, literary. I don't do anything with any entity that is based in Russia. Everyone has their own choices. That has been the choice that I feel comfortable with. But do I think about a return one day? Perhaps I do. And the thought of an experience like what Thomas Mann felt in 1949 is, I will admit, a scary possibility. So let me conclude with saying that I am so happy to be here. It doesn't mean you can't take questions, but this is the end of the formal part, that I think I pray fervently for Ukraine's triumph and victory, as I also do for Israel's victorious continuous survival amidst her enemies. And I think it's wonderful that you have this forum that gives people of different opinions who all share a love for Ukraine a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. I'm so glad that we have you today. We corresponded for a long time, and your history in a way repeats mine. I'm also about 40 years in this country, and we are, well, 40 years, I didn't mean anything mystical in this number, but we know what it refers to. And your last poem and commentary on Thomas Mann, actually, it was my question, because we all, you and me definitely, are asked to draw this parallel more than once. People say everything will pass and everything will be, behind. But I personally, that's my question to you, but my commentary on this is that analogy is not very good here, because what happened in Germany was on the memory of basically one generation. The nightmare came and passed in a way through the defeat. It was the same people, the same country in a way. Here we are dealing with different historical situation. Germany never was this kind of empire that Russia was. The legacy carried by Soviet Union still lasts, and It's over the century, and these 40 proverbial years repeated already twice, if not thrice. So I quite recently only realized that people fighting, Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine, are grandchildren, those who fought in Afghanistan.
Yeah, which means that they are great grandchildren of those who fought in World War II.
Right.
That's
so
kind of a scary thought.
Too much biological time is passing, too much demography is buried and flooded. Memories do not survive definitely. Thomas Mann has seen it all from beginning to start. Right now, you don't have people even in Russian leadership who remember Second World War, let alone communist revolution. So it more, to me, it more resembles wars that I do not know, like 100 Years War in Europe in Middle Ages, or who knows how many thousands years wars in ancient history. So maybe we're entering this period, where we just cannot draw these analogies from recent European history.
No, it's an excellent point, Victor, and I share a lot of your reflections. I think the challenge of memory is that it is both cyclical and not cyclical. The challenge of the memory that we both draw on is that it is in some ways in contradiction with the patterns we expect of history, which is tyrants fall and murderers are punished. But this tyrant too will fall, and this regime too will be punished. And look, there was a strange moment in World War II history, which occurred in the fall of 1943, when the Allies met in Moscow for the so-called Moscow Declaration, a Moscow Memorandum. The war was hardly over. The Nazis were continuing to commit their crimes with the help of their local accomplices as well. But the Allies came together to make one obvious point, that when the war is over, there will be international tribunals of justice. And it's a powerful point to go back to. I think we too need to think now. And I know that Ukraine has made this point in its demands for peace, that war criminals should be brought to justice. I see no way out of this. And in this sense, while the example of Germany is imperfect, but there were international tribunals of justice, and there were also local tribunals of justice in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Germany itself, not just in the Soviet Union. So I think there will be those in Ukraine after Ukraine has emerged victorious.
Thank you so much. And we have a couple of more minutes, please, for comments or questions. Everyone, we really are very, very grateful that Maxim found time to be with us today. Katerina?
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's really a joy, and thanks for inviting me.
I really appreciate the story about Thomas Mann and going back on the anniversary of Goethe's birthday. I did not know that, and I think you're being very modest here in downplaying the parallels, because I think that is actually it's one experience from one poetic soul to another. But on our program, we've talked many times, as Victor has said, about like this uniquely awful situation that the Thomas Mann was in, and that the people are in today. But what I wanted to say is that I love hearing your poetry. I'm so glad you read it, as opposed to just, like sharing it with us so we read it for ourselves. I'm so glad to hear your voice in it. And I mean this as a compliment, and I don't know why I feel this way, but the entire time you're reading, it reminded me of the poet Seamus Heaney. Something about like the strength, the power, the passion, the empathy. I just wanted, I'm a big I have not read Seamus Heaney's poetry for a while, but it made a huge impact on me when I was in grad school, and I haven't thought about him in years. And now I'm listening to you, and I'm like, oh, I've seen a little bit of this greatness before. So I just wanted to kind of share that and just thank you for sharing your works with us.
That's very, very kind, and certainly incomparable praise, which I in no way deserve. But perhaps just one thing, I think I've heard Seamus Heaney read, and I think it's a certain un-American tradition, with the exception of poets like Robert Frost, who emphasized the prosody at the expense, at the expense of emphasizing a certain syntactic clarity of prose. Look, it's a different genre. There's a reason I wrote some of these poems in poetry as opposed to in polemical essays. And I think what I'm trying to do is simply do justice to the art that we practice in poetry. In my case, it's bilingual, it's with an accent. And that's, I guess, how it's going to have to be. Just one funny footnote. My older daughter pointed out yesterday, she overheard. So I continue to study Hebrew. So I'm doing kind of a higher level conversation class where I have to repeat. And she said, Papa, you speak Hebrew with a very strong Russian accent. And I said, something, I speak Italian with a strong Russian accent, because somehow I came from Russian to Hebrew and Russian to Italian, but French and German with an American accent. So in a sense, I think in my poetry, there are all these funny permutations of accents.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you, Victor.
And thank you so much, Maxim, for being with us. And come back, please, again. We haven't even touched upon Nabokov, on which Maxim is an expert, and we have a lot of things to relate and discuss. Maxim recently wrote a book on Bunin and Nabokov.
I am sure, based on everything I know about Nabokov, where his sympathies would have been, because Nabokov detested bullies and aggressors. So I'm more than sure that he would have been on Ukraine's side. There's one example that we can cite, which is when the Soviet Union invaded Finland during the brief winter war that it almost lost. A group of leading emigre intellectuals signed a proclamation which in which they openly voiced their support for Finland and not for Russia. And that included Nabokov, it included Merezhkovsky, Ivan Budin, Rachmaninoff, leading authors and intellectuals. So I'm happy to return, and we can speculate where Nabokov's support would have been. But I think it would have been squarely with Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Katerina, please.
It's Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!